Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This program is the third in a series of programs I'm doing on the great French writer Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne lived in 16th century France and is regarded as one of the great essay writers of all time. And what was his subject matter? Well, his subject matter was people, specifically human nature and life. What was his goal? His goal was to learn what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. Again, his goal was to find out what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. He wrote more than 100 essays. Most are no longer than 20 to 25 pages, and they are relatively easy to read. One can find collections of his essays at any good bookstore, such as Barnes & Noble, or at the library. In this program, I'm going to focus on Montaigne's essay on education and related essays, in which he addresses himself to the subject, what are the most important things we can learn in life? His essay on education is entitled, On the Education of Children, but it is in many ways applicable to people of all ages. It is essentially about lifelong education. Since education is such a hot-button issue today in the United States, his essays on education are extremely relevant. Near the beginning of his essay on his main essay on education, Montaigne comments, and I'm quoting him, "The most difficult and important problem confronting human knowledge seems to be the right rearing and education of children." Think of how the world would be transformed if all children, all people for that matter, had access to a truly good education. Is there a better way to increase the collective satisfaction of the human race? Montaigne was highly critical of the education system of his time. Remember, I pointed out that he lived in 16th century France. Allow me to give you his own words. I readily relapse into my reflections on the uselessness of our education system. Its aim has been to make us not good and wise, but learned. It has not taught us to follow and embrace virtue and wisdom. Interestingly, Montaigne says that one can be learned but not be a good person. He also comments, one can be learned but not have wisdom. For example, one can have terrific knowledge of chemistry or a foreign language, or even a master's degree in business administration, and not have wisdom. Well, what's Montaigne's idea of wisdom? A little later in this program, and in my next program, I'll concentrate on the answer to that question. But first, like Montaigne, more than a few famous people in history, more than a few famous intellectuals in history, have commented on the poor education they got and were highly critical of the education they received. Among these individuals are Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Nobel Prize winner Hermann Hesse, and the great American writer Mark Twain. Hesse said this: He said his schooling destroyed a great deal in him. And Mark Twain, in a humorous vein, commented, and I'm quoting him, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." Now back to the subject of wisdom. What did Montaigne mean by wisdom? You recall, he said one could be learned and not have wisdom. Well, by wisdom, Montaigne meant, among other things, good sense, good judgment. That expression comes up time and again in his writings. Wisdom also involves the ability to think critically so that one is not a slave to the majority opinion of one's society. Indeed, Walt Whitman provides some enlightenment here. Whitman said this: "Re-examine all you have been told in school or church or in any book, and dismiss what insults your soul." Today, critical thinking would involve an ability to understand how one might be influenced by the advertising industry, the television, movie, and music industries. Wisdom for Montaigne also involved a commitment to trying to be a decent person. Montaigne believed it was impossible to have wisdom without being a good human being. And also, and this is kind of a summary explanation of Montaigne's idea of wisdom, he said this. He said, wisdom is the knowledge of how to live well and die well. Montaigne objected to the usual method employed to teach children and older students. Again, his own words. The usual way is to shout into the student's ear as if one were pouring water into a tunnel. And the student's business is to simply repeat what he has been told. Montaigne would have agreed with the poet William Butler Yeats that education is not the filling of a pail or the filling of a tunnel with water, but rather the lighting of a fire. Montaigne and Yeats both believed that there is too much emphasis on memorizing and not enough emphasis on critical thinking. By the way, did I say Yeats? I meant Yeats. Again, very famous poet. According to Montaigne, memorizing, meaning knowing by heart, is no knowledge. Knowing by heart is no knowledge. Those are Montaigne's words. He continues, it is merely a retention of what one has been told or what one has read into the keeping of the memory. Into the keeping of the memory. For Montaigne and many other great thinkers, memorizing is very different from learning, from understanding, from being able to use and get help from what one has memorized. Again, memorizing is very different from learning, from understanding, from being able to use and get help from what one has memorized. The idea is one must jump the gap from memorizing to thinking. Montaigne believed that education should also help students to develop good judgment. Good judgment will better serve them in life than a good memory. Montaigne comments that excellent memories are often coupled with poor judgment. Indeed, he uses the expression feeble judgment. Montaigne often emphasizes the distinction between knowledge of academic subjects, and good judgment. Let me give a contemporary example concerning the television program Jeopardy! Perhaps you have seen it. Well, one can win much money on this program by having a good memory. But one can win much money and still have terrible judgment in everyday living, simply because one has a good memory and, again, can do well on a program like Jeopardy! Does not mean that one has good judgment in everyday living. For example, in one's choice of a marital partner, how to relate to friends and other people, in making financial decisions, how to deal with anxiety and frustration, how to deal with one's sex drive. A good memory is not going to help one to deal with one's envy. A good memory is not going to help one to look in the right places for joy, and will not help us to go about feeling good about ourselves. So many of the great writers in history, especially psychologists and psychiatrists, have claimed that so many people look in the wrong places to feel good about themselves. T.S. Eliot, the great poet, put it this way: half of the harm that is done in this world is due to people struggling to feel important. They are absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves. Psychiatrist Alfred Adler contended that many people use power trips with other people to try to compensate for their feelings of inferiority. Adler said this, again, psychiatrist Alfred Adler: the goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others is the goal that directs the activity of most human beings. And Adler, of course, believed that if one was trying to feel good about oneself by exercising power over other people, that would not lead to a satisfying life. Montaigne and so many others in history have believed that wise people know how to feel good about themselves without power trips and harming other people. Indeed, the great thinkers have claimed the best path to self-esteem is helping others. The idea is that by being of service to others, we will feel better about ourselves. Jesus, the great psychologist, and by the way, when I quote Jesus, as I often do in my programs, I'm not quoting Jesus as being God. Some people, of course, believe Jesus was God. Some don't. I don't take a position in my programs. In my private life, I'd be happy to give you my opinion. But so many great thinkers, even those who didn't believe Jesus was God, have believed that Jesus had some very profound things to say, and that, in a sense, he was a great psychologist. In any event, Jesus warns us about pride and arrogance and the problems they can cause us. He said this: pride goes before ruin, arrogance before failure. He went on to say, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves shall be exalted. Those who humble themselves shall be exalted. Jesus talked about what makes a person great. Again, his own words. He who wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Montaigne, in his essay on education, talks about the various methods that one can use in educating children, young adults, and even older adults. He says that different methods can be successful, but his preference seems to be for the Socratic method. And what is the Socratic method? I suspect many of your teachers have employed it. Well, according to the Socratic method, the good teacher is one who asks good questions, thought-provoking questions, questions that encourage students to think critically. In other words, if a teacher is employing the Socratic method in trying to educate people, it means that teacher is generally avoiding lecturing. Oh, he or she may talk for 4 or 5 minutes at a time, but nevertheless, there will be very important questions the teacher will ask the students in the course of the lesson. Montaigne also believed that the good teacher encourages curiosity. Montaigne attached a lot of importance to this. His own words, "Let an honest curiosity be instilled in the student, so that he may inquire into everything." According to Montaigne, students should be taught to question the way the majority thinks. Why so? Well, because Montaigne, like so many great thinkers in history, believed the majority is often wrong. He wants students to cultivate wisdom and believes the majority of people, and believed the majority of people in any society don't have a great deal of wisdom. Montaigne addresses himself to the question, how does one teach critical thinking? Again, he attached so much importance to the teacher, the professor, teaching critical thinking. Again, his own words. The teacher should make his student sift through everything and take nothing into his head, and take nothing into his head on simple authority or trust. Let various opinions be put before the students. He will choose the right one. He will choose between them if he can. If not, he will remain in doubt. Montaigne goes on to say, only fools are certain and immovable. He says this, it pleases me as much to doubt as to know. It pleases me as much to doubt as to know. So Montaigne wants students in learning how to think critically to realize that so often we cannot have certainty and that there's nothing wrong with having doubts. Indeed, being a skeptic is often a sign of wisdom. Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think, puts this into perspective. Emerson put it this way, and again I'm quoting him. Very often, to know is the knowledge that we cannot know. Again, very often, to know is the knowledge that we cannot know. Montaigne talked about the importance of everyone learning philosophy. Montaigne's bias was that philosophy was the most important subject. And he lamented, Montaigne lamented that most children and teenagers didn't learn philosophy in school. His own words, since it is philosophy that teaches us how to live, and childhood, like other ages, has lessons to be learned from it, why is it children are never instructed in it? Again, meaning philosophy. Well, the French apparently read Montaigne's essays, of course they did, and a reflection of that is that today in France, today in the year 2008 in France, philosophy is a required subject in French secondary schools. It is important to remember that Montaigne is really, in a sense, writing about lifelong education, even though his essay zeroes in on the education of young people. What's so good about philosophy? Again, Montaigne attached so much importance to this subject. Well, he believed, if taught properly, it can be the most important subject in helping us to understand ourselves, human nature, and life. Montaigne attached a lot of importance to understanding. You recall, I mentioned early on in the program that he said that so often memorizing is quite different from understanding, that you can memorize something without understanding it. Well, so many of the great thinkers have talked about the importance of understanding. Epicurus, the great thinker of antiquity, put it this way: the highest happiness consists in understanding, because that can help us to avoid much grief. Epicurus' idea was that if we have a great understanding of people, of human nature, of ourselves, of life, that understanding can help us to avoid much sorrow in life. You recall the Buddha said that much of our pain is self-chosen. The great Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci, in talking about the importance of understanding, put it this way, and I'm quoting him: the noblest pleasure consists in the joy of understanding. And Plato, perhaps the greatest philosopher of all time, put it this way: the many think pleasure to be the greatest good. The smarter sort say understanding. And Jesus made this comment: the truth will make you free. The idea is that philosophy, and also great literature, can serve as an opening to a larger life. The idea is that philosophy and literature can change the way we talk to ourselves. Montaigne also believed that philosophy can do a good job, again, if taught properly, in helping people to develop good judgment. Montaigne believed, and I'm using his own words now, that philosophy is the molder of judgment and good manners. The idea is that philosophy can help us to develop good judgment in thinking deeply about our values. Again, philosophy can help us to develop good judgment in thinking deeply about our values. For example, how much to value social status, being popular, power, money, how much to value ambition. Montaigne claimed some people get carried away by their ambition and suffer for it. How much should one value public opinion? How much should one value sex, solitude, competition? In our society, there's a great emphasis on competition. But you should know some famous thinkers in history, such as Bertrand Russell, believed that being very competitive is more likely to make people unhappy than happy. But what do you think? Also, philosophy can help us to think more deeply about how much we should value virtue, being a decent person. Montaigne, in one key sentence in his essay, summarizes his view of a good education. And again, his own words. The main ideas which the student's mind should be made to absorb must be those that regulate his behavior and morals. That regulate his behavior and morals, and that teach him to know himself and also to know how to live well and die well. Montaigne believed that philosophy can also help us to think more clearly about where to look for joy, and also the proper attitude towards life and towards death. Montaigne wants students, indeed he wants all people, to think about what's really important in life. Montaigne, like so many great thinkers, believed the world is governed by false values, and he wanted people to be able to think critically about this and to develop their own value system. Finally, Montaigne believed that many students can do well in school but flunk life. How so? How can one do well in school and flunk life? Well, for a variety of reasons, but among them, poor judgment and inappropriate values. I'll have much more to say about Montaigne's philosophy next week. But as is my custom, I'd like to end with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. You recall, Thoreau believed we are all artists. And in his masterpiece, Walden, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."